Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans and you're watching the John Cedars channel from The Bunker. And in this video, it's my absolute pleasure to learn from someone with a better knowledge than most of us on the incredibly elusive subject of the mind. Jonas Kaplan is a cognitive neuroscientist at the University of Southern California's Brain and Creativity Institute, where he uses functional magnetic resonance imaging to study how the brain works, including the neural mechanisms that underlie belief. He's agreed to come on the John Cedars channel and share his knowledge on the subject of cognitive dissonance. Dr. Kaplan, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
So I guess just full disclosure, one of the reasons why I had to have you on is because my patrons are a very discerning bunch and they are anxious to learn more about cognitive dissonance, because especially when we're talking about groups like Jehovah's Witnesses, which I tend to focus on, but more or less any faith group, sooner or later you come up against this phenomenon where you're trying to speak to somebody who has very profoundly cherished beliefs, and you're presenting them with information that entirely dismantles what it is that they believe. And you can see the discomfort, and no matter how logical and coherent you are, it doesn't really matter, and they're able to somehow continue to sustain a flawed belief. So I'm anxious to learn from you as to how that works and why that is. Maybe if you could start off by telling us, spelling out what it is that you do and how you've come to the knowledge that you have.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm very much interested in exactly what you described. Why is it so difficult for us to change our minds when we're confronted with information that challenges us? And cognitive dissonance is definitely part of it. Maybe we could start by defining cognitive dissonance.
Please do.
Cognitive dissonance is that uncomfortable feeling we have when we find a conflict between our beliefs and values and something in the world. It could be some information we're accounting. It can be our own behavior. Sometimes there's conflict within us, right? Like if I feel like it's really important for me to be healthy, but I find myself eating a hamburger, there's a conflict there. How can I resolve this? And the brain is very uncomfortable with these kinds of conflicts. It does produce a negative feeling in us. And we take action to avoid that negative feeling, to resolve it when it comes up. There are lots of things we can do. I can stop eating the hamburger. That's one thing. That's one option I have. I can somehow rationalize why I'm eating the hamburger to fit the action in with my beliefs about health. Or I can just say, screw it. I don't care about being healthy. So there's a lot of different ways of doing it. One of the easiest ways for us to avoid cognitive dissonance is to just avoid things that challenge us. And I think we're very adept at doing that. And in a lot of ways, we engineer our social world to put us in a situation where we never have to encounter information that challenges our beliefs. And I think if we think about the function of belief and why we have beliefs, from a surface level, it seems like the reason we have beliefs is to create models about the world and to understand things and to find the truth. And that is one of the reasons. But the other reason we have beliefs is to share them with other people and to build bridges and communities. And in a lot of ways, belief becomes the glue that binds us together with other people. And so we create these communities like the Jehovah's Witnesses as an example, where everybody shares the same beliefs. And then because we all share the same beliefs, we don't have to encounter people challenging us all the time. And so avoiding information that challenges is probably the number one thing that we do to avoid cognitive dissonance. And unfortunately, I feel like it's getting easier and easier to avoid information that challenges us with the structure of the internet right now, right? We originally thought the internet was going to be this mechanism for delivering information everywhere. And it turns out it's really convenient for isolating us as well and for connecting us only with people that share our beliefs and avoiding those things. So as a cognitive neuroscientist, I study the neural basis of these phenomena. Why is it that we behave the way that we do, and how can understanding us from a biological perspective shed light on how it is that we behave and why we are the way we are? And we are not computers. We are living beings, and the brain is situated in a living body. And so understanding us as a holistic living creature is important for this phenomenon. One of the things that we study is what happens when we are actually confronted with information that challenges our belief. our beliefs, and where do these negative feelings come from? And to understand that, you have to start by thinking about what negative feelings are. The brain creates these feelings by monitoring our bodies. And most of these negative feelings have their roots in the state of our body at the given moment, right? The brain has a lot of machinery for keeping us alive and protecting us, making sure that we're healthy and avoiding things like spoiled food and danger. And all of those mechanisms come into play when we're trying to avoid information that the brain thinks can harm us as well. We find that when we use brain imaging techniques to look at what's happening in the brain when people are challenged in their beliefs. And one of the interesting things that we find is some of these old brain systems that are rooted in these emotional mechanisms for keeping us safe are active when we're challenged. One of the reasons that, yeah.
So it's almost like a survival instinct, like when you're challenged by something that conflicts with what you believe, there's almost like an existential crisis. Isn't that what you're saying?
Yeah, because the brain is not only trying to protect the body, but protect our psychological self as well. It's part of what's worth protecting to us, and that includes our beliefs and values. So one of the brain systems that is important for this and for cognitive dissonance in general is an area of the brain called the Insular Cortex. And this is a region of the brain that receives receives signals from the body. For example, if you encounter a piece of spoiled food, you might feel nauseous, and a lot of that negative feeling that's associated with the disgust of that moment has to do with the insula monitoring what's happening in your body. And we find that people activate the insular cortex during cognitive dissonance and during confrontations with information that challenges us. So encountering a piece of information that challenges your beliefs is very much like encountering a piece of spoiled food. You recoil from it, and your brain is activating these very, very same systems that are there to keep us away from food that's bad for us is now being used to keep us away from information that might damage our sense of self.
Indeed. Would it be fair to say that everyone has cognitive dissonance?
Everyone has cognitive dissonance, of course, and it's part of the healthy functioning of the mind. In the strive for consistency, it makes a lot of sense to sense when we're in conflict. We want our beliefs to be consistent with each other. I think the only problem becomes when it's so strong that we can't override it, right? We find that in our brain imaging work that people who activate these neural systems more strongly when they encounter information are less likely to change their minds. And so having the ability to control or suppress our feelings and to act, instead of acting sort of reflexively in the way that our feelings compel us to act, to be able to make a choice in the moment, I think is really important. And so perhaps one of the solutions here to help us stay more open-minded and more flexible in our beliefs is to learn to have some distance from our feelings and to learn how to interpret our feelings in a different way.
Well, I suppose, I'm definitely open to doing that because I've obviously developed, a belief system post being a Jehovah's Witness. But I still recognize the importance of challenging those beliefs. I don't want to be stuck with stuff that's not helpful to me because it's not true. So I like to think that I'm still fairly open-minded. But when it comes to the importance of challenging cognitive dissonance, you're somewhat preaching to the choir. Lots of people who are watching this are wondering, how on earth can we help our loved ones who are inside a very controlling group like Jehovah's Witnesses to understand that cognitive dissonance is even a thing so that they can start to combat it? Do you have any helpful tips there?
This is the $1 million question. I think that's it. I wish I had better answers for you. I can tell you some of my thoughts, but I don't think we have a solution for that.
Sure.
Right? One thing is to first recognize what doesn't work. And, what doesn't work is directly challenging people's beliefs. And we find that, in some cases, there's what's known as a backfire effect, where when you challenge people's beliefs with evidence, that those beliefs actually get stronger. Because when we feel challenged, we have to protect ourselves. And so we kind of shore up our defenses. So finding a way to communicate with people that doesn't bring up those defenses is really important. And so possibly one way of doing it is to start with shared values, to emphasize what it is that we share together, the beliefs that do bind us together, and work forward from there. I think that can help. But I I think it's a difficult problem. And instead of thinking about how I can best, how I can be more effective in communicating with other people, my emphasis is more switching the problem around and thinking, how can I be more flexible myself? And I know you talked about trying to do that yourself. I just think it's an easier problem to solve, and it's still so hard to do, even when you have the motivation to do it, right? That having some tools for that and finding out better ways that we can stay open-minded is really important. And I have some thoughts about that. I mean, the first thing is that once you form a belief, it's very, very hard to change, right? So it's much easier to prevent yourself from having a belief in the first place than it is to undo a belief that you already have. It's kind of like putting weight on your body. It's much easier to put on than it is to take off. So having some kind of initial barrier to what you accept is hugely important. And that basically comes down to skepticism. And in terms of life development, it's important that we teach children how to be appropriately skeptical, especially in an environment right now where there's so much information. We're basically in an information deluge. And our children will be growing up having to navigate all of this, and giving them the tools. I think this should be in a part of, perhaps one of the most important things that we teach them is how to filter that information out and decide what to accept and what not to accept. Because once you do accept something is true, it takes a lot of work to get rid of those things. Sorry.
So you're suggesting, cut off bad ideas at source. If you're aware, once you're aware of the problem of how hard it is to get rid of bad ideas.
Yeah, that's right. There are some experiments from social psychology where you tell people some fact, and then 10 minutes later you tell them that fact wasn't true, we just made it up. But you can still find evidence that they believe it. Even, they've only held this belief for 5 or 10 minutes, and it's still hard to get rid of. So it's a very insidious problem, and cutting things off at the source is probably one of the most important things that we can do. The other thing I think is, like you said, teaching people the fact of cognitive dissonance is, in a way, a kind of mindfulness of your own cognitive process, of understanding experientially how we work, and just, paying attention to the feelings that you have when you're confronting information, so that you can separate your automatic responses from what you intend to do. A lot of times we feel negative, and automatically we just try to recoil and get away from the thing that makes us feel negative. But if we feel ourselves doing that, and we understand how that process works, that might help us to stay in the box longer and find a better response. So practicing that through something like mindfulness practice is another promising avenue for increasing our open-mindedness. And we're going to be hopefully doing some research to investigate that in the lab to see if it actually works.
One problem that I encounter, or that people approach me with, and it's something that I can personally relate to, is that, as you've alluded to, bad ideas are so pervasive that they can stick around long after you've kind of consciously stopped believing them. So I get lots of ex-witnesses who approach me and say, I'm still plagued by fear that one day I'll maybe die at Armageddon, even though I know that none of that's real. The fears and the doubts and the paranoias still linger almost subconsciously, even though I've consciously separated myself from that belief structure. Would you say that that's a normal thing for someone to go through?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if they've held those beliefs for a long time and during certain important stages of life. The other thing that's probably important to recognize about beliefs is that they are not all the same. Some beliefs are more important to us than others, and particularly the ones that become part of our identity, part of who we think we are and the story of who we are. Those are the ones that we find are really, really hard to change, because it's like you've built this entire house, and now to pull out one piece of it would collapse the whole structure of the house, right? And if we grow up, especially during time of adolescence, when we're building our sense of who we are and creating that story of our lives, and we have certain beliefs that are important to that process, they might affect us forever, because that becomes so embedded in our sense of who we are. And like you said, you have a different set of beliefs now that you're not involved with the Jehovah's Witnesses. You're sort of building a new sense of self and a new identity. And all of those beliefs that become part of our identity, those are the ones that we have to be the most careful about, because those are the ones that are going to be hardest to change, the ones that actually define us.
Indeed. You mentioned, which probably will come as crushing news to some, that bad ideas can stick around forever. That being the case, would it be reasonable to say that it's perhaps unrealistic to shoot for the target of completely purging oneself of bad ideas? It's perhaps more realistic to reach a stage in your life where you can manage those bad ideas and those fears and those paranoias comfortably.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I mean, you can't erase the past. And, there is an emotional component to all of this. So, we have a rational system going on. We can decide to believe what we believe. But yes, there's going to be emotional systems that we can't necessarily erase the effects of. And it is important to when talking about the role of emotion in this whole process, it's important to emphasize that emotion isn't working against us necessarily. It's not like we want to be logical Vulcan machines that don't have any emotional involvement in a rational process. Emotion is very important for being a complete rational person. When we look at cases of brain damage where people have the parts of the brain that are important for incorporating emotions into their decision making, and people damage those parts of the brain, it's not like they become perfect decision makers. They actually become terrible decision makers because they can't use that emotional information, what it's going to feel like to be in a situation X or Y, to guide their decision making. So I think we have to embrace the emotional aspect of this whole process and realize that it's actually informing us of something. And we don't want to just suppress all those emotions that surround our beliefs. We want to deal with them somehow.
You gave us quite a detailed summary of what you've come to learn about cognitive dissonance and how you've come to learn it. And I find it fascinating that you've been able to look at images showing the parts of the brain that are firing when someone is experiencing this sort of discomfort. So that's kind of what and what you've been able to study. In terms of studying the field of cognitive dissonance, what is it? Is there anything that we don't know yet? Or maybe could you describe the direction that you would really like to go in finding out more about this phenomenon?
Yeah, we know so very little, really. We're just scratching the surface of understanding this. One of the things that there's several things I'd like to understand. One is how we differ from each other and why we differ from each other with respect to certain important factors that relate to cognitive dissonance. So in our studies, we use politics to study this phenomenon because kind of an easy way in for us. We can find people with very strong political beliefs and challenge them. But because we're on a college campus, we tend to have strongly liberal people here. That's just who's around us. And in Los Angeles, we tried to find people with differing political views. But we weren't able to do that. So, we know that conservatives and liberals differ very strongly in certain personality characteristics and also in terms of brain function. But we don't really understand how those differences came to be and why they're there. So that's something I'd really like to understand is how these things that relate to our different personalities with respect to how open-minded we are, and where those things come from, what aspects of our experience drive those, and what aspects of our biology drive those. That's one thing I'm interested in. But the other thing...
Yeah, that's fascinating. Just before you move on to the next thing,
sure.
And please remember the next thing that you're going to move on to.
I've got it.
I kind of intuitively have figured out that it seems to be in people's coding to swing one way or the other politically, and indeed one way or the other kind of religiously. So I'm fascinated to hear that you are kind of picking this up in your own research. Do you think it's going to be possible one day for someone to have a brain scan and for the person scanning their brain to immediately tell them, well, you're actually Republican and you're also religious, before they've even said anything?
It is theoretically possible, yes, absolutely. On the other hand, the differences are not as clear as you might expect. So we did a brain imaging study some time ago comparing fundamentalist Christians to non-believing atheists. And we asked them to evaluate statements, whether they were true or not, decide whether they were true or not. And some of the statements were religious in content. So, the devil really exists or not. And some of them were similar, but not religious. Santa Claus really exists. And we were hoping to find some differences in the way the religious people with the way their brains looked when they evaluated these statements compared to the atheists. But it was very difficult to find those things. What we found were more similarities in that when you believe something or disbelieve something, the patterns of brain activity look very similar, regardless of what the content of that belief is and regardless of who you are. So for a Christian believing in the devil, the brain looked very, very similar to an atheist believing in giraffes, or something like that. There were differences in the sense that when everyone thinks about things that have religious importance, whether they're an atheist or a Christian, there were certain emotional reactions that people had because these were self-defining statements, regardless of which side you were on. But there really wasn't a difference in believing versus non-believing in the religious versus non-religious people. And that was a little bit surprising to us.
Fascinating. Yeah.
In the United States, there is a strong association between religiousness and conservativeness. And so when we study the difference between liberals and conservatives, in some way we are also sometimes studying religiosity. And it's difficult to disentangle those things. It's difficult to disentangle. You said it's in people's coding. It's difficult to disentangle to what degree it is in their literal genetic coding versus in their early upbringing, because there are certainly cultural effects as well. But there is some indication of genetic associations between certain genetic factors and political orientation. So that's pretty interesting stuff.
That's just fascinating. You've educated me there. And there was something else before I cut you off that you were excited to kind of learn more about potentially.
The other thing is really just what are the interventions we can do that lead to more open-mindedness. And that's something we're exploring in my lab right now. We're looking at, for example, because we know these feelings that are so important when we experience cognitive dissonance or confrontation with beliefs that we don't want to confront. If we learn to control those feelings, does it make us more open-minded? So we're giving people training in emotion regulation strategies to teach them how to control their feelings of disgust when they encounter pictures of disgusting things, to see if that kind of learning transfers to a situation where we present them with information they don't like. That's the kind of research we're doing now. What kind of interventions can we do that lead to more open-mindedness? I think we need those.
Sure. One thing that I repeatedly find myself telling people, because I repeatedly get the question, what can I say to my loved ones that will help them be more open-minded about their beliefs, for example? And I repeatedly find myself saying, well, there's no magic bullet that will fix these issues. If there was, we wouldn't have this situation to begin with, because everyone who has a believing relative would have succeeded in reaching through to them, and the religion would have just shrunk right down. I don't know to what extent your research incorporates kind of mind-altering substances, but do you think it's possible that at any point in the future there will be some kind of medicinal application that could make people more susceptible to ditching bad ideas?
Yeah, I believe we do have those substances, and they're psychedelic substances. We have some indication that what happens, the field of brain imaging, what happens in our brain when we take psychedelics is very young because of legal restrictions on doing that research that were in place for so long. And finally, now we're starting to get some really good data on that. And what's interesting is there are certain brain networks that change in the psychedelic state that we know are important for self and identity, and are activated in our studies when we see people's beliefs challenged, for example. And so I think those substances that can help us to see everything, including ourselves, from a different perspective are the things that are most likely to lead to open-mindedness in terms of actual chemical interventions.
But presumably, if we did kind of at some point in the future, and you're saying that it's more or less available now, is it not also possible to use those sorts of substances to implant bad ideas or to basically manipulate people in a malicious way?
I don't think so. I think they're actually resistant to that, because what they do is they release the effects of learning on your mind temporarily. So it's not like just substituting in a new message. It's really releasing all messages. And that's something the U.S. government was interested in doing for a long time. Back at the CIA, back in the 50s, did those experiments to try to use psychedelics to influence people in that way. And I think it failed. I don't think it was successful. I don't think you can use them that way. I should say the other thing that we have The sort of science fiction version of what you're talking about is a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And this is where you, place a magnetic coil against the skull, and we're able to induce currents in the brain underneath the coil. And if you use this in the right way, you can interfere with the brain's processing. And there are some studies on cognitive dissonance using TMS that show that if you kind of zap the right area of the brain in the medial prefrontal cortex, that you can reduce the compensatory actions people take in response to cognitive dissonance. I don't think that's like any kind of practical solution for anybody, but it's interesting.
Fascinating. Well, listen, I'm just really glad that there are people like you who are studying this subject. I recently also spoke to someone who studies ostracism, and he was explaining about, the function of that feeling and the fact that it's basically a survival instinct, and it's really helping expand my knowledge. If anyone kind of wants to learn more about cognitive dissonance and how it works, are there any kind of accessible resources for the layperson that they might want to look into?
Yeah, honestly, the Wikipedia page is pretty good. It's always a good place to start. There's a nice Scientific American article on the topic that can get you into it. So I think there's definitely a lot of accessible information out there that people can read about, for sure.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Kaplan, it's been an absolute privilege having you on the channel. You've really opened my mind, as it were, made me more susceptible to knowing about this subject. So thank you for sharing your time with us.
You're welcome. And I also want to thank you for doing the work that you're doing. It's absolutely just as important. So
you're very kind. So viewers, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I know I have. Don't forget to subscribe to the John Cedars channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you for watching.